Hello. Welcome to another lecture in our course on Mahayana and the Buddhist text. We're going to deal tonight with the fact that, as I've said before, the advent of Mahayana in terms of what we can document is the appearance of text in written form, something that had never existed in Buddhism before. So tonight, the first thing I wish to talk to you about is the fact that the writing as a technology and what it has meant for Buddhism. It's been a great innovation. And so in many ways, people have made the point that Mahayana, rather than being an organized monastic institution with a lot of centers, was primarily a literary movement. So let's look at what the texts tell us. And part of the thing that I want to do is that I want to use tonight to show you that I'm turning to the text itself, that is the 8,000 line Perfection of Wisdom text, to see whether or not the redactors of the earliest Buddhist text in writing, that is, what did they have to say about the issues of Mahayana and the teachings that it carried with them. As far as I can tell, the very first mention of writing in any Buddhist material is this bit, which I've taken from the Chinese, but it actually, of course, was a translation from Sanskrit. It's in the 8,000 line Prajnaparamita. And in this one, instead of the usual comments between and dialogue between the Buddha and his arhats, in this case, he is speaking to Shakra, the Lord of the gods. So Shakra has joined the audience of where the Buddha is teaching the Prajnaparamita. And Shakra asks him a question. And this is the first time that writing is mentioned. O world-honored one, if on the one hand, gentle sons and daughters were to write out this Prajnaparamita, take it in mind and bear in mind the text of this sutra, make offerings to venerate, respect, praise it, etc., would they have greater merit? This was a significant moment in Buddhism. This was the moment when Mahayana, in many ways, was, as we know it, which was a literary tradition. It was born right here with the idea that writing was meritorious, produced a lot of merit, which made it a sacred act, a very significant statement. But let's look at writing in general. Writing is one of mankind's great technological advances. We have many early examples of writing that happened long before the time of the Buddha. In Sumeria, cuneiform, wedge-shaped images that were done in clay. And there are thousands of clay tablets still left from that early period, which was in the second millennium BC. You can see that they made various formations of the wedge-shaped wedges in the clay that carried with them sound. And that's what writing is, really. That the humans came to the place where they could say, let's make an image that has no meaning as such, but is used to remind us of a sound: ma, da, ka, ku, etc. Now, I think the Sumerian cuneiform was truly a remarkable early development, because it was purely symbolic placement of these wedges to make abstract images which carried sound. In Egypt, of course, they had hieroglyphics. And for a long time, people didn't know what to do with the hieroglyphic pictures, because they were pictures of animals and objects and snakes and birds, and people tried to tell a story based on the images. And it wasn't until they found the Rosetta Stone, where you find hieroglyphics and a Greek equivalent on the same piece of clay that was actually a stone carved in the stone, so that people began to realize these aren't just pictures, they carry sound. In the Americas, the Mayans were had a very early alphabet. And it wasn't until really the 20th century that somebody finally deciphered, because it appeared to be simply a series of pictures. And it took a very long time before one brave scholar put forward the concept: these are not pictures. This is not just a calendar of events. These are true alphabetic symbols that carry sound. Chinese did the same thing. They started off with pictographic display, like on the oracle bones. And these pictographics developed into sound. So the technology of writing in the West was from Crete, probably early on. They had pictographs. Their pictographs were very abstract and they carried sound. The Phoenicians, who were just on the coastline of what's now particularly Lebanon, took those pictographs, further abstracted them, and gave them their sound. This idea of an alphabet was picked up by the Greeks. The Greeks transferred it to Rome. And so what's called a Latin alphabet developed. And now in English, we say, oh, we have Roman letters. Our alphabet is from Rome, from the Latin. So we have a very long history of the technology of writing, which was transforming the ability of people in any language to represent the sounds of their language through these symbols. But it came late to India. We have no really good, solid evidence of an alphabet being used for sound until we come to the Ashoka inscriptions. That is, the inscriptions which Ashoka, King Ashoka, put on his pillars. And even those had to be deciphered, and people have finally to be able to read them, to find that it was in a kind of Prakrit, that is a vernacular, not pure Sanskrit, but a vernacular. And it was this Ashokan inscription, which is the one that allowed Buddhism to become a literary tradition. So, but some of our earliest examples of writing come from the Northwest. Birch bark, in this case, Koroshti, up in the Gandharan region. As we said before, this is one of the places where some people say we should put this as the birthplace of Mahayana. Well, it's certainly the birthplace of very early use of writing that has survived for us on these fragile birch bark manuscripts. So we know that by the turn of the Common Era, the Buddhists had started to write, and this written form was to transfer their sophisticated and sometimes quite difficult doctrinal material into a form which could be reproduced on a surface, in this case, birch bark, made into stacks of pages, if you want to call them that, and those could be distributed. So once Buddhism had writing, then a written text is its own witness. Anytime you get a written text, sometimes, as in this case, it's long after the time of the person who did it. We don't know who wrote it down in many cases. The text is its own witness. It is just what's there, and we have to take it and deal with it as it's there. Now, before there was the writing down, there was a whole period when the texts were chanted. And it is really interesting to me that chanting very often today involves not only the memory of the text, it can, but it can also be read. If you don't have the memory, you can read it. So when these texts began to be distributed worldwide in terms of the Buddhist world in Eurasia, in the Great Circle, people took those texts to be a description, a normative, a truly descriptive story or narrative of Buddhism and what it was like. When people began to travel, like from China to India, they were quite surprised to find that their Mahayana texts, which they prized so highly, did not seem to be describing what they found in India. What they found was that most monasteries were not Mahayana. And Mahayana monks tended to live in other monasteries. It was, again, a literary tradition. But once you have a literary tradition, it's followed by the development of new kinds of literature. Chanting, for example, it required that you had to have a certain number of monks chant together. And in that way, if one of them makes a mistake, it stands out and the others turn and correct them. So that to keep the authenticity of the material in a chanted form takes a lot of people. When you write it down and the text is its own witness, then you can have people begin to deal with ways of organizing or developing or commenting on the text itself. For example, you could have, as here, the attributes of the Buddha. Somebody could go through the text and pull them all out. That the attribute of the Buddha is a being without mistakes, a being without verbal mistakes, etc. So once you begin to gather data and organize it into this fashion, then you have commentaries developing, interpretations, a focus on structure. The people who put these together, we call redactors. In order to have a text, somebody had to write it down. But when you write it down, you have to make a lot of decisions. So if you're listening to my lecture and you're taking notes, which I don't necessarily recommend, what do you do with your notes? How do you organize them? How close would your notes really come to what I'm saying? Could somebody read your notes and reconstruct this lecture? You can see the difficulties. So the redactors of Buddhist texts were those who put them in writing. And after a time, the written text, particularly in Mahayana, the written text had more power even than the oral tradition. So having a monk who sat and read from a text was considered to be extremely powerful, because the proof of what was said long ago, people felt, has been recorded and is there on that surface. So the redactors of Buddhist texts, we can hardly call them authors. They didn't author in the sense of being creative writers. They took the oral chants which were present in their community and tried to make sure that they accurately transferred those chants into a written form on a surface, whether it was a palm leaf or a birch bark in the beginning, or later in China on paper, sometimes on stone, as we saw with the Ashokan pillars. We have texts that were done on copper plates. There were many surfaces that were used to try to put this writing. So now if we turn to the text itself, it not only says they wrote it down, but it says, if gentle sons and daughters make offerings to the text, in other words, the text, the actual book of the Prajnaparamita, is used as an object of veneration and ritual. And making offering to those texts compared to making offerings to stupas was considered far better than the stupa worship. It's not that they discounted the stupa worship, but they certainly put the focus on making offerings to the actual text. But then it goes further. Suppose you fill this entire cosmic realm of ours, which is made up, say, the Buddhist of, suppose you had a cosmic realm made up of 1 billion worlds. And you wonder, where did the Buddhists get the idea that the cosmos is made up of 1 billion worlds? You just can't see it in the starry sky. But they had a very sure belief that there were billions of worlds. So suppose you filled up the billions of worlds in the cosmos with sharira, that is, with the bodily relics after the cremation of the body. And you filled universes as numerous as the grains of sand in the river Ganges. And suppose that you compare this with doing reverence to the text of the Prajnaparamita. Which one would you choose? Well, the Prajnaparamita said there's no problem. You would choose the textual work over all of the material that you would put together to preserve and worship the relic and the stupa. Then the text tells us why would you do, what's the reason for this? And it says the wisdom of whole knowledge of the Buddhas and the Tathagatas all comes from Prajnaparamita. And when a Tathagata is cremated, like the Buddha was cremated, why does his relics have so much meaning? It's because they are still infused with the all-knowledge, the sarvajna, which he had when he was alive. It infused his body. But where did that come from? Well, they're saying the text of the Prajnaparamita, the mother of bodhisattvas, the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom that exists on the texts themselves, is the way in which this great power is transferred and infused in the body of a Buddha or a bodhisattva and makes their body worth revering after they have been cremated. So some people make a big issue about the book cult versus the relic cult in Buddhism, and there is a lot to say for that. But there is also, as you can see from this, the idea that the book itself carries the power which is infused eventually into the relic that winds up in the stupa. So it's a much more complex issue than we normally have when we just easily divide it into book cult and stupa cult. They were intertwined, they were interconnected. So if people are going to make offering to the text of the Prajnaparamita, to revere it, to put flowers, incense, etc. But then this passage is very important. You get a lot of merit from revering it, but the sons and daughters who write the text and therefore get merit, they get merit, good merit. However, if they give it to others, then their merit would be greater. In other words, not only is writing itself made sacred, but now they're saying the real power of it comes when you decide that you not only write it down, but you distributed it. You give it to others. You don't just write it for yourself. And so the spread of Buddhist texts, and therefore the spread of Mahayana, was considered to be of the highest meritorious benefit. And so even today, palm leaf manuscripts, they are still made all over Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. People are still making palm leaf manuscripts of the Buddhist text. And they're not just Mahayanists, they are the Theravadas too. They are the ones who are making hundreds of copies every day of Buddhist text on palm leaves as an act, a meritorious act. And to make it and give it to somebody else at Prajnaparamita, that's the very highest. And then a kind of surprise in the text. If gentle sons and daughters were to teach other beings to practice wholesome action, would this be a good thing? Yes, yes. However, teaching others to act in a good way does not compare to giving the text of the Prajnaparamita to other people, letting them or encouraging them to write it out, to study and recite it. That's even more important than meritorious action. So we have to say that the attempt to preserve the written word becomes enormously important and even carries more importance than teaching somebody wholesome action. Now, there is a problem. From the Prajnaparamita point of view, if a gentle son and daughter writes out the text, but thinks, oh, look at me, I am writing out the Prajnaparamita right this minute. This is a deed of Mara. Mara is the evil one. It is that you cannot, according to this, you should not, when merely writing the text, say, I write Prajnaparamita, look at me, what a wonderful person I am. Because if you get the meaning of the text, if you get the meaning of Prajnaparamita, if you get the meaning of the teaching that's on the text, then you shouldn't just hold on to the physical text itself, and hold up the leaves that you have copied. So again, they were praising writing, but they would say the writing is in one sense secondary to the meaning of the teaching which is put into that writing. And we should never forget that. So don't just praise yourself for copying a sutra. If you don't deal with the meaning of the sutra, then the copying of that sutra and your pride in that, they say, is a deed of the evil one. Now, another issue for Mahayana was it something that came from the forest monks, the monks who went out into the wilderness, who lived solitary lives, meditating as wandering ascetics? Or was the redaction of text something which was done in an urban environment where you had many monks living together daily, studying, working together? There's an argument. Scholars take different sides on this. But I have to say, I've never seen any of, maybe it's been done, I just haven't seen it. I've never seen anyone who asked the question, does the Prajnaparamita, the early Mahayana text, have something to say about whether or not their material came from the forest or from an urban environment? Did they think this was an issue? Did they understand this question? And this is very important, because when we come to the text, the great arhat in the Prajnaparamita text is Subhuti. And sometimes people say Subhuti was the foremost of those who dwelled in the forest. Others disagree and say, no, the word is a mistaken word. He was the foremost of those who dwelt in contemplation. So what does the Prajnaparamita itself say about this, if it says anything? And it actually does. It comes out from, again, Mara, the evil one. The evil one spots a monk out in the forest, sitting alone, and creeps up behind the monk and says, "Oh, gentle son, practicing seclusion is always praised by the Tathagata." The sutra now says that the Buddha turns to Subhuti and says, "Subhuti, I do not teach that bodhisattvas seclude themselves, either in a wilderness or an empty space or in mountains or beneath a tree or in the remote wilds. I have never taught that that's what a bodhisattva does." So, does that mean, therefore, that this was an indication that the urban environment is better? So the text goes on. Seclusion, which was praised by Mara. But if you're secluded, and while you're secluded, your thoughts are not separated from that of ordinary people who have to listen and hear the teaching or partake of Buddhas, who get it, but who don't share it. And if therefore in seclusion, you don't cultivate the perfection of wisdom in order to have whole knowledge or whole wisdom, then Subhuti, dwelling in the forest, is contaminated. It's contaminated practice. It's just like we said a minute ago about one who writes down the text and thinks, I am writing a text, look at me, hooray. That someone who goes out into the forest and is sitting there thinking lesser thoughts, then just because they're in a forest doesn't make what they're doing better. So the forest dweller, according to Mara, says, I see non-human beings, spirits, who keep me in mind and come to aid me when I'm out here in the forest. I practice the true seclusion condoned by the Buddhas. You who dwell in the village, who's going to give you help? There are no spirits in the village. They're all out here in the forest. And so says the text, those bodhisattvas in training who believe and that their practice is pure and that the practice of other people is impure, what about them? Then comes one of the strongest statements, I think, in any Buddhist text in a negative. Any person who makes a distinction between a forest and an urban monk, to say that where you are, whether you're practicing in the wilderness or in the city, makes you either better or less worthy, you should know that the person who thinks this is a low-class chandala. Very bad word. Chandala is a demon of a bodhisattva. Know that people who think this are filthy, stinking, defiled, and impure. I mean, this is strong language. One should know that a person who thinks this is just a charlatan bodhisattva. They're the greatest rogue in the whole world. And the world is made up of gods and human beings. They are nothing but a thief in the guise of a shramana, a wandering ascetic. So those who think that these people who make a distinction, you should not approach them, you should have nothing to do with such people, they're arrogant. So if they say, look at me, I'm out in the forest, I'm the best and you are the least, well, you can see very, very strong words about them. So what is the reason for it? They are ignorant, they're vain. So what are you going to do about it? How can you deal with this? Then it softens. And it says that one who seeks the Buddhas, Prajnaparamita, always seeks their own benefit and will always have fearful of the three steps of being, past, present, and future. When they see these people who brag about that one form is better than another, that those who live in the forest are better than those who are in the urban, or those who are in the urban are better than those in the forest. What should you do with regard to them? They're chundalas, they're rogues. You should have loving kindness toward them, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity toward these people. That seems to me to be the main message of Buddhism, and certainly a message which Prajnaparamita carries. If you think you've got the answer, how do you know you've got the answer? You'll know if you have the right answer if at the moment when you have your answer, and the answer is people who make a distinction are vile, they're arrogant, they're vain, they're foolish. The moment you have that insight, you have compassion. That's what the Buddhists are constantly reminding us. Yes, you can say some really negative things, but at the same moment, you have a tear in your eye for the arrogant and the vain as you see them. So if we look at early Prajnaparamita texts, they tell us a great deal about the issues of the arising of this Prajnaparamita text. They tell us about how writing was thought about. They tell us how they felt about the difference between living in the solitary wilderness in the rainforest or living in a monastic environment with other people. They tell us a lot. So I hope that you can use the translation that we've been using for this, that I've been showing from the Chinese, my translation, that this is the way in which the Prajnaparamita described itself, described Mahayana, described Buddhism, described how people should act. There's a great deal of material here. So thank you very much. See you next time.